Hello, and welcome to Parenting Your ADHD Child with the Brain in Mind. My name is Jared Jeanette.
And I'm Deanne Jeanette, and we're Embrace Parent Coaching. We're here today to help you with learning how to use brain-based strategies to connect and to stay connected with your ADHD child. One thing that's really important to us about today is that we are not just offering you another sales pitch webinar. We want you to know that we're just parents who've been probably where you are now with your ADHD child and struggling, and knew that we needed more help. In fact, I remember vividly the day a couple of years ago when I finally had to recognize and say, I need something more. In fact, I think we were crying, and well, maybe it was just me who was crying, but still, we had to admit that all of our previous knowledge that we had in education and training with about education, psychology, and parent coaching just wasn't enough to help us with our child. We knew we needed more.
Yeah. And so as we began to research, we began to learn that there is a new way of parenting. This new way of parenting keeps in mind what is happening in our child's brain and what is happening in our brains. There's been so much that's been learned over the last 20 to 30 years, really, about what's happening in kids' brains when stress is happening and how that affects their behavior and how that affects our brains. And once we begin to keep that in mind, then we can also begin to keep in mind how we can use these strategies to build cooperation instead of fighting and meltdowns with our kids.
As we began to watch our new knowledge of the brain and parenting strategies help decrease our ADHD child's explosive behaviors, we knew we needed to continue, and we knew that we also needed to share them with others.
And that's why you're here. That's why we're here. So what is it that we want you to walk away with? What we want you to walk away with, first of all, is a changed perspective on your child's behavior and the impact of the brain on the brain development on that behavior.
We also want you to understand how your child's unmet needs underline his or her behavior.
And finally, we want you to discover the power of empathy and its ability to help your child think and solve problems.
One of my greatest fears as my child would exhibit explosive behavior, and as he became older and older at a time when it wasn't typical to do so, I was so worried that my child was just a brat, or that something was wrong with him, or that I was a terrible parent who'd let him get out of control. I want to say to you right now, don't worry. Your kid's not a brat. Most likely it's not because you let your child do anything that's led you to this point, but it's simply that your child needs to have more connections in the brain grown, and those connections need to become stronger and faster.
So, what are those things that people say about children? What are they said about our children? What have we said about those kids that we see that their behavior just seems, well, let's start with one. Maybe their child is obnoxious.
Or you fear your child is rude or arrogant.
Maybe you're worried that your child is going to grow up to be lazy or just completely uninvested.
Maybe you feel like your child is really manipulating you and others around him or her.
So often we hear people saying, oh, that kid, they're acting up. They're just looking for attention.
She's so stubborn. And did you see how defiant she was with her mother?
Or maybe we just talk about all the tantrums and fits and outbursts that this kid has. The challenging thing, the problem with all of these things is they are so focused on the behavior, and then our parenting is in response to that behavior. So then we're left trying to figure out what are the right ways to motivate our kids. Really, there's this underlying assumption with these statements about kids that really it's about motivation. A kid will do well when they want to, is the assumption. So then we have to find the right thing to motivate our kid to do well. So then we rely on things like sticker charts and rewards, or maybe even the negative. We think about consequences and punishments. When really what we need is to change the lens through which we view our child's behavior. And we had to go through that. And this is what radically changed our parenting style. Our perspective changed when we started believing that kids do well when they can. It was no longer about motivation. It was about ability. What was keeping our kids from doing well?
We can't bring peace to our home until we can begin to change our perspectives and view our children in a different way. Our children are extremely sensitive, and they can sense what we're feeling and what we're believing about them. When we begin to see that our kids aren't being bad on purpose, but that they can't do or meet the expectations that we have for them, then we begin to see them in a new light, and they sense that too.
Here's a really good example of what we're talking about, something that you might be able to relate to. We want you to go ahead and try and read this. Now, it may be that you can look at that, and maybe if you've got the right training, the right skills, you can read that right off the top. But my hunch is most of you that are looking at this have no clue what this says. But what if I promised you that I would give you $20 if you could figure this out?
What if we threatened to take away your car keys or your cell phone? Would that motivate you to figure out how to read it?
Or maybe if we said we go from $20 to $100, that you could just read it right here on the spot. Are you beginning to see that motivating you, either positively or negatively, doesn't matter if you don't have the skills to be able to read this simple Hebrew phrase?
Often we're asking our children to do something that either is developmentally inappropriate or it's something that they just don't have the skills to be able to do them. Either way, we're asking or expecting them to do something they just cannot do.
Just like you couldn't read this simple phrase, it just says Boker Tov, and in Hebrew that just means good morning, without training and without developing the skills, your kids can't do well. So we had to change our perspective. And once we've done that now, we begin to look at behaviors in a completely new way. When we see our kid acting obnoxious, we begin to realize that maybe they need to develop the skill of impulse control.
When I see another kid being rude or arrogant, I begin to wonder, does that child need some help with learning how to read and respond to social cues in an appropriate way?
When we look at those kids that maybe we used to label as lazy or uninvested, what we begin to realize is maybe that kid needs to be able to learn how to be persistent.
When we used to think that a child was manipulative, perhaps they lack the skill to appropriately solve problems in their world.
Those kids that we used to say were just looking for attention, now all of a sudden we realize that they need to gain this skill of learning how to get their needs met in an appropriate way.
If you have a child that's stubborn and defiant, perhaps they need help with developing the skill of flexible thinking.
And those kids that were throwing tantrums and fits and outbursts, maybe they need to learn better how to express their concerns in a little bit better way.
In order to change our perspective, we need to really look at behaviors not through labels, but through skills that haven't yet been developed. So we need to think about these behaviors and ask ourselves the question, what is this really about? But when we focus on changing behaviors instead of teaching skills, we actually miss the opportunity to build connections in our child's brain and to deepen their trust in us.
So let's start thinking about needs. What is it that your child needs in order to be able to do well? Every kid has 3 unspoken needs. In fact, even as adults, we really need these 2. What we need and what your child needs is they need to feel safe.
We need to feel loved.
And they need to solve problems. So what can we do to help that? What we can do is we can begin to use empathy. Empathy can unlock our ability to help our child access those needs, name those needs, and now all of a sudden we can begin to work together to address those needs.
We all have sympathy for people, that feeling that you care about someone else's trouble or grief. But with those people in our lives who we are deeply connected with, we need to go deeper to empathy. For you see, empathy is the ability to understand and actually share in the feelings of another. Now, as human beings, we aren't capable of being able to empathize with everyone. It overloads us. But in those deep connections within our immediate family, we can and need to actually share in the feelings of another. Why is this? It's because you see, empathy drives us to connection. Dr. Brené Brown from Harvard University has done a lot of study on human beings and empathy. She said empathy is a choice. It's actually a very vulnerable choice that drives us to connection, while sympathy drives us to disconnection. You know, sometimes I realize with my own kids and with other people, in order to save myself pain sometimes, I use sympathy. It's hard that, that he feels that way or she feels that way. But when I use genuine empathy and begin to share in that feeling with him or her, then our child begins to really feel our empathy and that love. And it begins to meet all of those unspoken needs we referred to earlier when we talked about feeling safe, feeling loved, and being able to solve problems.
Now, the interesting thing is empathy isn't just simply kind of a mushy-gushy thing. There's literally biology that's happening when we offer empathy. I want to share with you just a little bit of that. You can see from this arrow here, I'm circling this little thing, this red part. It's called the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is where a lot of our thinking takes place. It's where executive function happens. It's where cause and effect happens. That when we say, you're in timeout because you did this, if our kid is going to be able to take that in, that's going to happen in the frontal lobe.
In fact, the frontal lobe is where we are able to regulate and control our emotions. And then we can make cause and effect thinking to solve problems. All of our problem solving happens in that frontal lobe of the brain.
But now if we look down here a little bit farther, you can see I'm circling this kind of purple area right behind the cerebellum, the spinal cord, really up towards the top, there's the brain stem. And inside the brain stem, there is this little part, it's called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is what sometimes we call that the reptilian part of the brain. And the amygdala is the part that begins to release cortisol. Cortisol is a great thing in the midst of stress. When we feel threatened, cortisol comes in and it's the thing that we say it releases the fight, flight, or freeze response. We need that when we feel threatened because we need to know, do we need to run? Do we need to hide? Do we need to fight? But the problem is for some of our kids, that sense of threat is heightened. It can happen for any number of reasons. But for our kiddos that are quick to respond emotionally, that amygdala kicks out the cortisol. They feel threatened. And what happens then is it blocks the kid's ability to access the frontal lobe. They can no longer really have access to that part that solves problems, and they are just simply in that fight, flight, or freeze mode.
So when that cortisol is pumping and our child can't get to the frontal lobe and can't get to the place where they can be thinking, they are not able to receive our instruction at that point. So oftentimes our discipline and our typical discipline actually happens when we're both in this mode, where we both have cortisol pumping. I'm angry. The child sees my anger as a perceived threat. The cortisol in my brain is pumping out, and I am staying right down here in this temporal lobe, which is completely emotionally driven. And so when that happens, so let's say, for example, if I say to my child, you hit your sister, you are in timeout. Or you hit your sister, you are losing video games for the rest of the day. I'm not thinking cause and effect, and neither is my child. So the stress, the cortisol, is discounting our ability to bring connection from here and the emotional way of thinking up to here, the problem-solving part of thinking. And so your child may change a behavior due to fear, but it's not long-term, and it teaches your child how to hide, or for some of our kids with explosive behaviors, it just doesn't change the behavior at all. It just continues to encourage them to stay in their emotional brain.
But here's the great thing about empathy. Empathy, when we can access it, when we don't dive into that cortisol place, when we can stay as parents in our frontal lobe and offer empathy to our child, what that does is that tells the amygdala to calm down, everything's going to be okay, the cortisol level begins to decrease, and the child can begin to access the frontal lobe again. So that's how this biology of empathy is so important. That's why it works for us as parents, is because it allows our child to move from that feeling of threat and into the place where they can begin to identify and solve the problems. So what does empathy look like with our kids?
When our perspective is changed and we understand the biology of empathy, and we understand the biology of what is happening in the brain in the middle of family difficulties, now we know, okay, we can show empathy in different ways. We can identify or name their feeling. Say, I see you look really upset or really afraid.
We can share that we would feel the same way. Oh my gosh, if that would have happened to me, I would be so upset.
We can offer physical reassurance, like a hug or cuddle. by asking, "May I hug you now?" Or "May I touch your hand?"
And if it's possible, we can even give time. Sometimes it may not be a good time to do that if there's a real sense of threat or a lack of physical safety. But if possible, we can say, we're going to deal with this in a little bit.
So we now understand that empathy can actually provide the safety and the environment for our child not to feel that they have to protect themselves, and can help us access that frontal lobe or that thinking in the brain.
So we want to ask, what is it that we hope that you can do with this information? The first thing is that we want you to begin to examine the labels that you have for your child, that maybe others have placed on your child. What are those things that people are saying that you might even feel? And what are the ways that you can be looking at that from a new perspective?
We also then challenge you to look for the unspoken needs your child is expressing. Their need to feel safe, their need to feel loved, and their need to be able to solve a problem.
And you really need to make sure that you're looking at those from your child's perspective. Sometimes, I know in the past, I've been guilty of saying, why is he so upset? He's fine. He's loved. But it doesn't matter if I think he should feel that way, or it doesn't matter if you think your daughter should feel that way. What matters is, what is your child feeling right now? And the last thing that we want you to do is to begin to embrace empathy as the primary way to begin to help your child solve problems. The more that you can offer empathy to your child, the better chance you've got of beginning the process of helping your child solve their problems.
Now, we know that this isn't all-encompassing, and we can't put everything into one webinar for you. But there are ways to continue on down this path. We believe that if you just begin to do the things that we've talked about today, you will begin to see a change, an improvement in the peace level in your home. However, there will still be more questions you'll have. There'll still be things you'll wonder, how do I do this? So we want to make sure that you have resources for you as you move forward in the future. There are a few things that we recommend. One is you can read our free ebook, and if you click on the button here, you'll be able to download our free ebook that's 10 brain-based strategies for dealing with your child's meltdown. When your child's cortisol is pumping and the meltdown is happening, there are some more specific ways. We've given you kind of the understanding and the thinking behind it. This book will actually give you the strategies to do that. Also, we encourage you to check out our website, embraceparentcoaching.com. And we actually send out an Embrace weekly update on the journey to ADHD parenting with the brain in mind. And each week we try to send out an update, journal article that will give you strategies to try something else and to be on this new way of parenting. We also encourage you to check out the websites of other trusted resources. We encouraged you to think about Dr. Ross Greene earlier, and he has a website at livesinthebalance.org. We have also learned a lot from peacefulparenting.com, and so these things could be helpful to you as well. But we also know that there might be still some more that you want, and in that case, we have put together a webinar pack that is just for you today as you have listened to this webinar and been a part of it with us. It's called Brain-Based Problem Solving for the ADHD Child, and it actually contains 3 separate webinars that will give you more in-depth strategies and understanding. The first one is going to be the power of connection, empathy, and your child's unspoken needs.
The second one is identifying your child's unsolved problems to build the brain. This will be an opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about how some of those problems that may not be stated out loud will be an opportunity to build up that brain of your child.
And finally, developing a plan to build brain connections through family problem solving. Some of you may be saying, if I don't use punishment and I don't use reward and consequences the same way I did before, what do I do to help us build cooperation and to help my child be able to have the behavioral expectations that other people have? And you actually can do that by having a detailed plan on family problem solving. So these will go into much more detail. And if you click on the button, you can, for today, you can order that for $27. We're just so grateful that you guys have been with us today. We're hoping that this webinar will truly start you down a path that will help bring you much of the comfort and the peace that we have found through changing our perspective, through being more empathetic with our children, and through building that trust that they have with us. So please, like we said, feel free to contact us. Check out this webinar pack and see if it's for you. Or keep in contact with us through embraceparentcoaching.com.
Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.